with the three disciples there where Moses and Elijah meet the Lord, holds converse high and sweet. Earlier this week, I was needing some space to get away from everything and some time for prayer and sleep. So I headed out to Shelter Island for a 3-day personal retreat. I needed to pray and I needed to sleep. And sometimes, I have to admit, those two things blended together. And so, like those three disciples who, as Andrea read for us, find themselves weighed down with sleep, what would begin in prayer might well drift off into sleep. Like a lot of you, sleeping has been hard over these past 2 years for me. We've been on such a roller coaster of emotions and challenges, and sometimes those things make it hard to get a good night's sleep. I always read aloud to Charlene at night to make it easier for us both to fall asleep. Sometimes I read the same few pages over and over again 3 nights in a row, because neither of us can remember what happened in the book the night before. Sometimes I read aloud and she falls asleep, and sometimes I read aloud and I fall asleep, and sometimes I'm reading aloud and my eyes close and I'm still reading aloud something. And Charlene will startle awake and say, "What?" Because whatever is coming out of my mouth has nothing to do with the story. So I'm sympathetic to Peter and his 2 buddies. After a couple of years on the road with Jesus, not knowing where they would be sleeping from one night to the next, they probably need to catch up on sleep wherever, however, whenever they can. And I have to confess that leaving the city for the quiet of Shelter Island was really as much about catching up on sleep as it was about catching the Spirit. I'm weary, and aren't we all? I thought it was a good week to get away for 2 reasons. First, last week was a bit of a slow time around here before the rush of Lent. And second, I needed space away from a constant barrage of news. Difficult news. Getting away from the news is a challenge for me. I'm a little bit of a news addict. As the week went on and things heated up in Eastern Europe, it was hard and then it was impossible not to seek out reports of what was happening in Ukraine and in Russia. I found, as Jesus could have told me, as Jesus himself found out long ago, temporal troubles exert a strong pull on our spiritual and contemplative moments. For Jesus, even there on the top of the mountain, a time of such potent spiritual connection, somehow hanging out with and conversing with Moses and Elijah, the spiritual giants of his faith. Even there, and even then, the pull of the valley was not far away, and the pull of the valley was strong. Back to that in a moment. For me, the longer I stayed on retreat, the harder it was to ignore what was happening in Kiev and Lviv and Lugansk and in Moscow, and the less I wanted to ignore that. Because my spiritual practice, such as it was, kept causing me to wonder and worry about these unfolding events, and those unfolding events drew me back into a desperate need for petitionary prayer. Please, God, do something. Help us do something to avert this catastrophe, to lessen the pain and the suffering. So at some point, I just stopped trying to separate those 2 things, the spiritual and the temporal. They were bound up together. A few days ago, I shared with some of you the heartbreaking posts from Bishop Edward Kagay. Now, there are not that many United Methodists in that part of the world, and so Bishop Kagay serves as bishop to churches in both Ukraine and in Russia. He himself lives in Russia, but asked us on Tuesday to pray for the church and the people in Lugansk, Ukraine. And then on Thursday, I could hear his pain as he posted from Russia, from Moscow. We were taught as a child that we need an army to protect us, not to attack. We were proud that our ancestors stood up for their land. How could we turn from defenders of our homeland to aggressors? Haven't we learned anything from the bitter experiences of Napoleon and Hitler? I am ashamed of my country, he wrote. And I hurt for the loss of human lives. This is a disgrace, he wrote. After that post, I didn't hear anything or see anything from him. And as I kept listening to the news from Russia about brave people like him standing up against war, standing up for peace, demonstrating, protesting, and often being rounded up and arrested, as I heard about all these things happening, I grew worried for the bishop. So yesterday I reached out and I got in touch with him, and I heard back and found out that he's okay. But the church in Ukraine is not okay. The world is not okay. The world is not okay. It's a situation that requires prayer, and it requires prayerful action, and it requires transformation. Perhaps today we would consider it transfiguration. Transfiguration of the world, transfiguration of our souls, of our bodies. The transfiguration of Jesus is a puzzling, weird little story. What is it that happens up there? And does it happen right before Peter's sleepy eyes, or does it happen in Peter's sleepy mind, or does it happen in both places? Let's look for a moment at this story. To be sure, Peter is exhausted, as Luke tells us. It's been a rough road. As we learned a few weeks back, Peter signs up for this Jesus thing on the spur of the moment, very impulsively, not really knowing what it was all about or what it would involve or where it would lead him or what it would cost. And at this point in the story, Peter and the other disciples are weary. And so Luke tells us after some 2 years on the road with Jesus, Peter and James and John are weighed down with sleep. And yet, as Luke tells us, these disciples are then jolted awake, and so they witness something. They see something. They witness Jesus in his glorious reality as well as his gritty earthiness, fully human and fully divine, as the theologians put it. They witness a kind of spiritual summit happening right in front of their sleepy eyes, with Jesus chatting amiably with Moses and Elijah. Moses, the great liberator and lawgiver. Elijah, the greatest of the prophets, the teller of truth, the defier of kings. And Luke tells us that these three giants of the faith are holding a strategy session. A strategy session about what? About Jesus' departure. In Greek, interestingly, the word is exodus, which means departure or escape or simply the way out. And this way out is to be accomplished, Luke tells us, this departure is to be accomplished in Jerusalem. And how is it to be accomplished? Through the cross, through the suffering and pain and torture and death on the cross. So let's assume that's what's going on in front of Peter and James and John. It's not an easy conversation. No wonder Peter wants to interrupt that conversation with some practical suggestions. changing the subject. Let's forget about that, Peter seems to be saying. Let's forget about all that negative thinking. Let's stay up here, says impulsive, practical Peter. Look, says Peter, we can make you 3 shelters, 3 skenas in Greek, 3 tabernacles, 3 tents. One for you, one for Moses, one for our friend Elijah. At this point in the story, Luke helpfully and parenthetically adds that Peter doesn't know what he's saying. It's like me reading a book out loud with my eyes closed. Peter doesn't know what he's talking about, and he wasn't making sense. He's babbling, as though somehow he can't shut up. But God shuts him up. God overshadows this whole scene with this cloud, and from the cloud comes a voice. In Jewish tradition, a divine voice like this is called a bat kol, which literally means a daughter of a voice. A daughter of a voice. And this daughter of a voice tells Peter to just shut up. If you don't think that God sometimes tells us to shut up, you probably need to pray more often. This divine voice, this bat kol, says to Peter and the other 2 disciples, "This is my beloved child. Listen to him." Listen to him. Do what? Listen. Don't talk. Just listen. How important it is to listen to Jesus. How different Christianity would be if Christians would just listen to Jesus. Listen to the words of Jesus. Talk less. Listen more. Listen to him. And when the voice was gone, there was only Jesus standing there. Now, if we stop there in the story, we don't understand the story. How come? Because the story keeps going. The story goes on. Jesus won't stay there atop that mountain because the pull of the valley is strong. And when the 3 disciples come down the mountain into the valley with Jesus, they find a world in desperate need. They find a family in desperate need, in need of healing, in need of deliverance, and they find that their fellow disciples at that point are unable to do anything much about it. But the story still goes on. And by the time Jesus effects his departure, his exodus, through the cross and resurrection and through the ascension, by the time Jesus is ready to not abandon them, but to leave them, the disciples finally have their eyes wide open, find their voices, find their power, and find that they can do the work, that work of love and justice, that work of love and reconciliation that the rest of the world so desperately needs, still needs. As I continue to pray out there on Shelter Island, I began to pray online through my little telephone. I began to connect and reconnect with people in Ukraine and in harm's way. Some amazing disciples, followers of Jesus, who were not leaving, but were staying put to serve the people who were there in such a desperate situation. And one of these empowered disciples is a Methodist pastor named Oleg Starudabuts, who lives in Kiev. With his spouse, Yulia, Pastor Oleg posted a desperate request yesterday to help them supply things for people who are taking shelter in the subways and other underground places of safety. And he grew so desperate that he posted all his banking information about how to do that. Now, I know less about banking than I do about most things. But I asked our wonderful bookkeeper, Jennifer, if there's a way that we could pull funds from our Good Samaritan Fund and do an international transfer to help with this work. Well, Jennifer who, in addition to being an amazing person who puts up with much worse than late Saturday night requests for help from me, is also a former investment bank VP, and so she said sure, she would figure it out, and asked if it was okay to add $100 from her family to the sum that I'd requested. I'm sure she would not want me to tell you that. But the truth is this. We may not be so swift with Swift. We may not be up on some mountaintop with Jesus, able to catch a glimpse of the glory of God, but here on the floor of the valley, where we live, where we are, where God's people are, in our troubled and troubling world, there are more than a few followers of Jesus who are able and willing to do that work of love and justice, many of them sitting in this very room. And so if we open our eyes, our hearts, our voices, if we open our eyes to what's going on around us, we may well catch glimpses of the kind of truth that speaks through faithful action. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Amen.